So, to stay on time, I may introduce Mr. Wolfgang Klein from Knox. Just in case it's crap and you want to port him at the end, give him now. There we go.
Thanks, Shane.
Okay.
I must admit, when Shane first asked me to speak, I thought it was just to a small group of arborists. He never mentioned that it was at a seminar like this, because if he'd told me that, I wouldn't have volunteered. But anyway, here I am, and we'll do the best we can. Let's try this. Okay. When we look at the tree management process in the Australian Standard, it says the success of tree management will depend on the cooperation of all involved in the design and development team. And that is particularly true. I found, just let me backtrack for a moment, I spent 5 years at Kingston in a role very, very similar to what I've got at Knox. I've been there for over 10, going on about 11 years. So I have a fair bit of experience dealing with trees and development sites and so forth. So while I'm not an expert, and I recognise there are many others here who would be better qualified to speak about the subject here, I would like to present a viewpoint about tree protection. I am very much in favour of the Australian Standard. I think it's a fantastic document for several reasons. One is it gives us a common starting point. Prior to 2009, when the Australian Standard came about, we had several other standards from America and England that were being used, and we really couldn't get consensus. Everyone was jockeying for their own particular formula. But I think since this time, I think we have something that works. There's a common language there, and I think it's really important that as arborists that we pull together to try and protect trees, where it's warranted. So this is on page 7, and this is the opening clause of the tree management process. What is a tree protection zone? Well, the Australian Standard says that it is a specified area above and below ground, and at a given distance from the trunk set aside for the protection of a tree's roots and crown, to provide for the viability and stability of a tree, to be retained where it is potentially subject to damage by development. So when we look at a tree protection zone, we've got to look at the below ground parts, and we've also got to look at the above ground parts. And we know a tree most trees don't have perfect symmetry, either above or below. And I raise a question to you: how much of the tree can we remove before we affect its viability, or before we affect its stability? The tree protection zone is the principal means of protecting trees on development sites, and the TPZ is a combination of the root area and the crown area requiring protection. I think all of us would agree with that. Can I see a show of hands of how many people use the Australian Standards on a daily or weekly or sort of monthly basis? That's nearly everyone. Amazing, fantastic. So the TPZ is it is an area isolated from construction disturbance so that the tree remains viable. I had an interesting question raised to me at VCAT just before Christmas of last year, and they said, is encroachment still encroachment if the encroachment doesn't damage the tree? And I'll go to that a bit later on, But it really got me thinking about this. And of course we know that the TPZ incorporates a structural root zone. What do we mean by protection? And I think it's really important to define what we mean by our terms. So the Macquarie Dictionary, the 4th edition, it's a heavy book, says that it's the act of protecting, the state of being unprotected, preservation from injury or harm, something that protects. And the verb, which is protect, to defend or guard from attack, invasion, annoyance, insult, etc., cover or shield from injury or danger. So I think we get an understanding of when we're talking about trees, like we don't want to see roots damaged or bark torn off or sort of branches or stems cut off. That affects the functioning of the tree. What do we mean to keep a tree viable? Viable being noun, and it's also viability being the noun and viable being the adjective. When we go down to the 4th, like the botany meaning of that is able to live and grow, and the physiology meaning of that is physically fitted to live. So is it possible to have a tree that we've retained on site no longer being a viable specimen? I certainly see many of them that tend to die 12 months, 18 months, sort of 2 years later. And yes, they've been kept, but they're no longer viable. And we can go more into that after. And what do we mean by the word vigour? So, again, the Macquarie Dictionary says it's a force of healthy growth in any living matter or organism as a plant. And in AS 4970, which is Australian Standard, it says ability of a tree to sustain its life processes. Key point, ability of a tree to sustain its life processes. The term vigour in this document is synonymous with commonly used terms such as health and vitality. And I want you to I would like you all to remember that, because my experience has shown, like not in every case, but in some cases, that we keep trees that don't have vigour, that don't have vitality, and it's just a cost shifting from the developer to the new person that buys the property, because that tree ends up getting removed. So the TPZ really hasn't done its function. And stability. So stability, again, the Macquarie Dictionary says firmness in position, continuance without change, permanence, steadfastness of character or purpose. And I think this particularly relates to the structural root zone, but we'll see more of that shortly. Determining the TPZ. The radius of the TPZ is calculated for each tree by multiplying its diameter at breast height by 12. So the DBH, which is the diameter breast height, is measured at 1.4 metres above the ground, and then that is multiplied by 12. So the radius of the TPZ, so the tree protection zone is a radius that goes out from the trunk and out. That is measured from the centre of the stem at ground level. Oops. Sorry. From the Australian Standard, I've photocopied that. I don't know how well it is, but that just gives you some diagrams to show where the DBH can be measured on the different tree shapes, on slope, on sloping ground and so forth. I'm hoping everyone's got access to a copy, but and of course the structural root zone, which is the SRZ, is the area required for tree stability. A larger area is required to maintain a viable tree, which is a tree protection zone. The Australian Standard says the SRZ only needs to be calculated when major encroachment into a TPZ is proposed. There are Now, I think what we need to remember, and again this is from page 12 of clause 3.35 of the Australian Standard, there are many factors that affect the size of the structural root zone: tree height, crown area, soil type, soil moisture, natural or built structures. This is also true for the root system in general. One of the things that often come across is that people draw a circle, so they've got the radius and they draw a circle around the tree, and that's what they work with. It has no bearing on where the root system is, and I'll explain why later. The area around the base of a tree required for the tree stability in the ground, this is still to do with the structural root system. The woody root growth and soil cohesion in this area are necessary to hold the tree upright. The SRZ is nominally circular with the trunk at its centre and is expressed by its radius in metres. Now we know from Greg's talk that is not always the case, that sometimes it can be elliptical, oval. It really depends on the forces acting on the tree, the soil types, the wind direction and so forth. So one size doesn't fit all. And I think what I see happen with the Australian Standard is that TPZ area, that circle, people see that as one size fits all. And it just doesn't. Okay, I'll move on. I've got quite a bit to cover. So determining the structural root zone, so in brackets, like the diameter measured above the buttress, and that's usually, I guess it depends on the tree, but it might be 10, 20 centimetres above the ground. And that's multiplied by 50. Don't forget with the diameter that unless it is a metre, you need to put a decimal point in front. Then you multiply that by the exponent, power 2. So most computers have a scientific calculator that you can download. Don't treat that as a square root, it's not. And then you multiply that by 0.64. So that actually will give you the structural root zone. The notes I've taken off the Australian Standard is, RSRZ is the structural root zone radius. D is the diameter measured immediately above the root buttress, so it's not the same measurement as when you measure for the TPZ. The SRZ for trees with trunk diameters less than 0.15 metres will be 1.5 metres, so that's a starting point. The SRZ formula and graph do not apply to palms, other monocots, cycads and tree ferns, though I've seen people apply to them. This does not apply to trees with an asymmetric root plate. And yet I think most reports we get, Steve, they all show the symmetric root plate. Amazing. And you go out and you find that that's not the case. Again, this is off the Australian Standard, so we can see the crown area. We can see that's the TPZ. We can see that's that's the crown. We can see that as the TPZ there. We can see that as the structural root zone for a crown. And most trees I come across have asymmetric crowns. We can see that the TPZ needs to protect the crown, so it needs to be protected, and the TPZ basically just stays with the trunk, unless of course it's a asymmetric root plate. Now there are many variations to this, and I'm sure that the ones who go out and who do the assessments and that will basically have come across a lot more than what is shown in the Australian Standards. I just want to go back to what is a tree, and again this is taken from the Australian Standards. So we know if a tree is, it's a long-lived woody perennial plant greater than, or usually greater than 3 metres in height with one or relatively few main stems or trunks, or is defined by the determining authority. And the talk that Shannon and Steve gave this morning, oftentimes in those schedules, it will define what a tree is, under that particular overlay. We know the tree crown consists of the massive foliage, branches, stems growing outward from the trunk of the tree. The average crown spread is the average horizontal width of the crown taken from drip line to drip line as one moves around the crown, usually on a north-south and east-west axis. I don't want to go into the physiology. We're all arborists here. I think the talk that Greg gave just before lunch about roots, like we all understand that leaves are important in the process of photosynthesis, and that the tree makes its food in the top part, that the root is the sink for the carbohydrates, and that I'm hoping I don't need to spend any more time on that. So the root system consists of three main parts. Again, this is from the Australian Standard. The structural woody roots, anchorage, storage and transport. The lower order roots, anchorage, storage and transport. And non-woody roots, absorption of water and nutrients, extension, synthesis of amino acids and growth regulators. And what people think often, and I'm hoping... I recently did the course that Mark Hartley and Adam Thoms, thank you. I had Tom, but I couldn't think of Adam. Ran at the conference here. It was amazing. Like, they actually got us to go out and look at roots, and what we thought were absorbing roots under the microscope weren't. Like, they're just superised roots. And absorbing roots are only one cell wide and have a nucleus, and they're ephemeral. They don't last very long on a tree. But we understand that the roots are very important to the health of the tree. The root shoot balance and all that. I also thought, well, most trees have a mycorrhizal network, a symbiotic association of the mycelium of the fungus with the roots of the plant. That's not mentioned in the Australian Standard. But where I come, like where I work with, we have a lot of indigenous trees, we have a lot of natural areas, and we have areas where richer mycorrhizal fungi, and the mycorrhizal network of these trees is very important to the health of these trees. And yet, very rarely do I see that considered in reports or in suggestions about retaining trees. Very rarely. So we know the relationship is mutually beneficial for both the tree and the fungus. So there's two main types, like the ectomycorrhizes, and then there's the endomycorrhizes. One actually lives outside the cell, the root, and the other one actually lives inside. Penetrates the cell wall and that. I think Greg showed this. I think we've taken it from the same source about the extent and spread. We know that has changed our view of tree root systems. The works of Perry and others. In terms of the roots are long and they're quite shallow. This will start making sense in a minute. From there, I'll just go into encroachment. What is encroachment? So, the Australian Standards advise it may be possible to encroach into or make variations to the standard tree protection zone. I'm glad Greg said what he did, because it does give us an opportunity to be flexible. But from where I sit, in my experience, I see the 10% as a starting point. A lot of arborists don't start at the tree protection zone and then look to see where the 10% is doable. A lot of them start right at the 10% mark and then want to encroach further. So we know the Australian Standard includes excavation, compaction, fill, and machine trenching as a definition of encroachment. I'll just go back to that VCAT hearing. The VCAT chairman and the person who was running the applicant's case, said, well, is encroachment still encroachment? For example, if you put a driveway over a root system and you use structural soils and like you use permeable paving and that, and there's no damage to to the root system. And it was late in the day and I had to think really, really hard. Because on the face of it, like the Australian standard allows encroachment. My counter to that was I tried to explain the importance of the root system and why it's important to the tree. And although there may be no damage to the roots there and then, you got things like rain shadows, altered soil water patterns, lowered oxygen gradients. You've got a whole range of things that that happen that may not work to to the benefit of that tree. In this instance, if you imagine a tree, there were units all around, and then the tree was surrounded on all sides by paving running off to the garages, and the buildings themselves only represented 10% encroachment overall onto this large Eucalyptus cephalocarpa TPZ. The driveway and all around bumped that up to over 80%. I thought, well, are we really serious about retaining this tree? I mean, trees need space. This is a tree that has an established root system. Arborists can't heal, we can't fix things. We can make sure we create conditions that are conducive to maintaining healthy growth, like mulching and watering and so forth. But once the damage is done, it's done. And there is a real disconnect between what we read in reports and what actually happens on site. I know I'm jumping around here a bit, but oftentimes, look, the 10% isn't an issue. But yet when you go through them, well, there's nothing here about what they're going to do to help the tree to prepare it for the changes that are occurring. Sure, that 10% may not, but I want to at least see some mulching, watering, perhaps even some fertilising, perhaps some coring and things like that. It just doesn't happen. Of course, major encroachment is more than 10%. So, to encroach, to advance beyond proper limits, make gradual inroads. In these definitions in the Macquarie Dictionary, it doesn't say that something has to be damaged. It doesn't say something has to be injured. It's making advances beyond the proper limit. So if the TPZ is the proper limit to what we're saying in the Australian Standard says that this is what is required to keep a tree viable, healthy and so forth, then of course if we're going to construct things within that, it is an encroachment. So encroachment, the noun, it means the act of encroachment, anything taken by encroaching. And we see it again with the Australian Standard, we see the 10% encroachments in that only represent 10% of the total TPZ area. Okay? Now the Australian Standard also says that when we encroach, we need to offset a similar area around that TPZ, like for what it's been lost. Oftentimes it's impossible to do because the tree has already been encroached 10, 15 years earlier by units next door, and there is no space on the subject site. And adding 10% here without knowing what roots are there and creating the conditions that are going to promote healthy root growth and that, It's a pointless exercise. Have I allowed 10% encroachment? Yes, and I'll show you a photo of of what was done. And I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm saying that there is a tendency to use it as a starting point and not to set the tree up to cope with the changes that are occurring or that are going to occur. Does the TPZ accurately depict where the majority of tree roots grow? Well, Susan Day and Eric Wiseman in the Arborist News carried out a review of the scientific literature from around the world to urban and landscape tree roots. They found that the canopy width and tree height aren't very useful for estimating the spread of the root system, even on open-grown trees. They found that the trunk diameter is a much better predictor of root spread. So the Australian standard uses the trunk. Fantastic, great. However, their review of the literature found that for young trees less than approximately 20 centimetres in diameter, the ratio of root radius to trunk diameter in documented studies was about 38 to 1. We're allowing 12 to 1. We're saying that is acceptable. And with encroachments in that, we're even saying less than that is acceptable without evidence. I'm the sort of person that says, look, yes, we can do this. Show me the roots. I want to see the roots. If you can show me where the roots are, then I can make up my own mind about whether or not what you're proposing is good for the tree or whether it's bad for the tree. And sort of, if we go back to these circles, in no way can anyone tell me where the roots are growing because they're below ground. I defy anyone to go and site, and we can try this after, where roots aren't growing above the ground, to show me where the majority of the roots are. I find it hard. I find it virtually impossible. And I've been involved in many cases where we've asked for root exploratory works using air knife, using using the hydro. In some cases, the arborist has used an excavator. Very interesting. But that's so. The literature is showing that trunk diameter, and most of the trees I see in the urban environment where development's occurring, fit that 20 plus centimetres thing. Most of them have only just started to, have just started to go into maturity. Got very long lives ahead. We know that the roots are going to grow further. Anyway, so what it says is that another one of the findings was there was not enough data for conifers, and the relationship cannot be applied to palms. There are a lot less data on large mature trees. However, this relationship probably changes for older trees. Existing studies suggest root spread levels off to some extent as trees age. And there's quite a lot of, if you do the literature search, you'll find that. Older trees spend a greater proportion of their resources on maintenance of tissue and less on growth. And in the classic case is the study that Ashton did back in 40s or 50s, the 1950s, where he looked at young mountain ash from, I think, cotyledon stage all through to the sapling, to the pole stage, to the mature, to the over-senescent. And what he found was the biggest growth occurred at that pole mature stage. Mature stage might last a couple of 100 years. The senescent stage might even last 100 years. But the transition between the mature and the senescent stage was that the root system was starting to contract through disease and insect damage and all sorts of things fungi and so forth. So, other key research findings of the literature review advises roadside works and other surfaces can restrict root extension. They're not always. The number of times that I've read in reports, there's no roots under this garage, and say, look, humour me, just dig a trench there. and you find masses of roots underneath the garage. Doesn't happen always, but, you know, root systems are not uniformly distributed around a tree. We all know that. But yet we treat that circle as being sacrosanct, and that represents, 10% encroachment, not an issue. There are barriers to deep roots developing, but we know roots do develop deeply into soils, and it really depends on the soil type. We know that. Like yellow box is a classic case in point. Obliqua, very rarely. Species matter, but common urban tree species can grow deep roots. I started off in this job before there were stump grinders. So all our tree removal was by axe and pickaxe, and you develop a really good appreciation to where roots grow. Trust me, it always surprised me, and I used to hate digging out liquid ambers. So this is from Trees and Development, a technical guide. This is from Nelda Matney and James Clark, and here they're depicting the roots spreading far further than what the canopy is. And we know, we know and understand that this is the general case with trees. So, to me, tree protection zones are really important. And I fight for them to try and get as much as we can. That if we're going to keep a tree, then let's make sure that we set it up so that it can survive. If we can't keep the tree, because of where it's located, and because of yield and a whole range of other factors, then let's get rid of it and plant something that we know will survive. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Wolfgang, you seem to be championing the idea that obviously that probably all agree with you that root systems are not symmetrical and are not, within that beautiful round circle. But as a great starting point that Australian standards gives us to argue and defend tree protection zones and VCAT and justify our jobs without even having to go to VCAT, how do we then, because you seem a bit frustrated that there's more to the root system than actually we're allowing for, how do you have a suggestion on how we can work towards getting to somewhere where I think whether you realise you're heading in that direction, whether you've got an end result or not, do you have an end result or not?
Yep, I've got some photos coming up to show you. Now, I know I've been criticised for asking developers to fund root exploratory works. Considering what they make on a property, I think $1,500 or $2,000 is a small pittance to pay for something that will either increase their yield or put a very small dent in their profit margin. I mean, it doesn't even beg talking about, but I'll show you. So here we get to the slide. So this is in Rowville, and these trees were supposed to be protected, and wonderful, isn't it? Yeah, brick fence is more important than the tree that had to be retained. So let's just sever every root on that side. Lovely wall, love the wall. Again, here we see the roots severed, soil stockpiled and that. This used to be the norm. It's gradually disappearing, and I think it's disappearing because we have the Australian standard. I think that has made the difference as more and more people come on board and use the Australian standard as the benchmark. It is making a difference. You might ask, well, why isn't council doing more about this? It's an issue of resourcing. We don't project manage these jobs. We issue permits that allows the person to construct a house. We issue a permit that says that tree must be protected. Now, council does not have the resources to send people around here every day to make sure that this person is doing or living up to the conditions of the permit. In a perfect world, yeah, maybe, but that's not the reality.
Is it your council that asks for the the name of it, consulting
Yes.
arborist.
Yes.
Which is great.
Yeah. This is the other thing that oftentimes, look, I understand that the arborist at the start of the project gets a set of plans, very much the same plans like that I get. Doesn't have drainage lines, doesn't have the landscaping on it by and large, where the services are going. All that comes at the end. I've asked, well, why can't we have it at the outset? Because this has an important bearing on what happens to the tree protection zone. I can't do it because the plan might change, and it's too costly. Okay. So we have drainage engineers, we have Steve and Darren, who are dynamite. They are fantastic. I'd recommend any council in a planning department has the drainage people sitting with their planners, and has people like Steve and Darren sitting there with them. Because part of the permit condition that they have to, that they can't start until they've got condition 1 plans, and Darren and Steve and Pete and Suba and all that basically make sure the plans coincide. I think Shane will back us up on this, and make sure that the tree protection zones are properly protected, that there's no services like running through. So I can understand that the arborist at the outset, when he sees that, doesn't have full information. I don't have full information either. But at least I raise the issue and say, look, if we're going to keep this tree, we need to make sure that it's adequately protected. This is pre-2009. I don't know how many people would be familiar with this sort of excavation work. We asked him, why did he keep digging? There's a driveway up there. And the soil kept falling in. This is in the foothills. He said, the soil kept subsiding. I said, didn't you think to stop? No, we just wanted to get rid of the soil. I don't know. So that was a driveway that they cut up into the site. You see here trees leaning, roots all severed, no care. We weren't aware of this until a neighbour rang and sort of made us aware. We put a stop work order on it straight away. The building inspectors became involved because it was an unstable site, and we just shut it down. It cost him an absolute mozza. The person who owned this and who did this actually ended up selling the site to someone else who else inherited the problems to make it, like to correct it. That very rarely happens now. I can't think of the last time something like that happened. Steve, can you? And I think again largely is due to the Australian standard. This is in Hayes Court. There was a well-known arboricultural company did a fantastic job on writing up the tree report on the TPZs and everything else. Again, this is what happened. I didn't read the report. They weren't interested in the report. We didn't know about it. The trouble is, by the time a permit's issued, it might be a year before they start. Like, no one rings us up and says, listen, we're going to start the site works. And there's also a definition of what sort of constitutes works. So this site today, I think, only has one of the original trees left, and these are all indigenous.
And what sort of, did they get kicked up the bum there, or?
The enforcement guys took it on. I don't know. That's a different part, and you try and work with him, and I think his response to the landscaping was succulents and agave in a pebble garden. So that's, how do you work with someone who doesn't appreciate trees? If anyone knows the answer, I'd really be keen to know. Again, this is another one where came out, neighbour phoned us, said, look, they're cutting down trees. Went out, sure enough. Not only were they cutting them down, they also had the excavator there digging them out. This is the healthy, there's no decay in there. Oh, they were dangerous.
Yeah.
I had to cut them down because they were dangerous. And then what you can't see here is that what they've done just here is there's a big excavation that's where they're going to put the extension, and the trees were in the way. But they're dangerous. And of course, this is Callistemon viminalis, and this is what you do when, I don't know, I said, what were you thinking? Like, didn't you think the tree's going to fall over? No, but that's where our garage has got to go. Yeah, but mate, you've got a tree there that you've undermined. Look at all the roots you've cut. Of course, that's no longer there. And then this is one I was intimately involved with doing the tree assessment and all that, and issuing a permit to construct a second dwelling to the rear. These are street trees. There's a couple on his property. See all the roots that they've just cut through? Now, there was fencing up. We watched them. We weren't aware they'd taken the fencing down because the house had been built. We weren't aware that they'd removed the fencing and then they brought in this machine, and they did that, I think, in a day. So all our good work, all our good efforts about tree protection zones and all that, which were working fine up until that time, insult to injury, bark off the trees.
That would have been on the plan though, where they
Yes.
service trees.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
as far as the builder's concerned, he hasn't done anything wrong.
No, but see, the thing is that oftentimes we deal with the applicant. Like the arborist on the other side will be dealing with the applicant, and the applicant lodges the application for a permit to construct that. Now, the applicant oftentimes is a building consultant who then, once they get the permit, passes it on to the owner. The owner subcontracts the build of that to a building contractor. The building contractor never looks at the permit. All they're interested is in getting the building plans and making sure it's constructed in the right spot. And the system's not perfect, but you know, I just want to illustrate that even with the best laid plans, sometimes things don't work out the way you want them to. This went to enforcement too. This is another one. I was called out. They actually did this work before they lodged the application. So they didn't want to be stymied. So you can see here where all the roots are. Most of the trees are gone. There is a large tree that has its roots through there. And I don't know, I must be getting old. I said, look, the damage is done. What can you do? You find them is not going to make one iota of difference to, you know, we need to educate. We need to get these people to plant more trees. Let's see how we can salvage something with the landscaping. You know, you try, even sometimes like this, you've got to work, you know, you've got to swallow the rage inside. And I say rage because I get really angry sometimes because of the stupidity of people. Not all people, just some. Anyway, sorry.
When you talk about education, I note that underneath council and community, are they from your website? Did you put
Yes.
pictures up on the website?
No.
So you can educate the neighbours so they can bring
No.
up...
No, this is a slide. I did this PowerPoint on Saturday afternoon because I didn't have time during the week. We're a bit short-staffed at the moment, and I'm nearly done. Sorry, Shane. Again, more stupidity. In this case, the trees had to go. Just, yeah. Now, the question before, we asked for exploratory works, and we asked them for where they're wanting to encroach or along the building line. This is done with an air knife, so you get a fairly good understanding of what roots are there. And you get a feel, I mean, I'm not saying that by looking at that we know what percentage of roots that this represents on the tree. You can't do that unless you excavate the whole, and there's no point to doing that. But if we want to keep this tree, the extent and the mass or the density of roots there should give us some understanding if what they're proposing is a goer. Or whether or not we're best to say, no, look, let's pull back a bit, let's leave these roots intact because they're important to the tree. So here we use hydro. Now I know some people are going to say, oh yes, but the bark's blown off and all that. This is an ongoing battle. I don't care if there's mud on roots. I don't care if the roots are encased in dirt. I don't want to see this sort of damage. And I don't want to see it painted. So it's a matter of having that conversation with your contractor and reiterating, look, we really want to see the roots, but we don't want them damaged in the process. Not a perfect process, but at least it allows you to see what is there. Again, hydro excavation, you can see roots all the way through there. Some large ones through there. So you can build up a fairly good picture of better than just looking like if that hadn't been excavated. I mean, you wouldn't know. You just wouldn't know. This is one. Please be patient. The decisions we make don't end at the point of our report. They live on. And I know I've had discussions with arborists who said, well, we're not responsible for who moves into that house. Yeah, but if you're saying that it's all right to construct within that tree protection zone, even if that tree is not damaged and you've got the crown over the roof of the building, yes, we don't know who is going to live there. I can guarantee you, just from past experience, that people are going to want that tree removed, particularly after a stormy thing. So they'll use all sorts of excuses, mess and so forth. This is a cephalocarpa that we went to great pains to keep, an indigenous tree in Knoxfield. You can see it over the roof, you can see it there. This tree is now gone. That one's still there, but this one we've had allowed to be removed because by the time they cut everything off the roof and stuff like that, there was nothing left. And again, the decision was, there was a compromise about constructing within, within the TPZ there. Yes, the roots weren't damaged, the house isn't damaged, but it's a no-win situation for the tree. So we are responsible, and we need to keep in mind, the above, like the above ground parts, like where they're going to sit in the space. We can't walk away and think, oh yeah, well, I've got a good outcome, and that's the end of it. I've actually referred some people back to the original consulting arborists and said, you ring them. They were the ones that argued that that's not an issue. Don't argue with me because I was saying it can't be done, that we don't want, a big maculata within so many metres of a house. I understand your concerns, but I'm not the one that, had this discussion with them. It didn't go over well. It came back, it was council's decision. No, it wasn't. Bloody rat bag. People who won't own their decisions. This is a Eucalyptus Nicolai, this is Allendale Road. You see, there's a house there, lovely tree, single tree, we decided to keep it. The applicant, the owner, was really happy to keep it. They put permeable paving. There is a stormwater detention system in. This was bored, not trenched. Okay, so they bored through. Healthy trees come through. Owner gives me a call. People have bought this unit. He goes around there the next day. 2 drill holes. Even after your best efforts, even after you've got consensus, yes, and it's built, what do you do? They're just some of the... I'm just...
Not beer.
This tree failed 2005. You can see, all solid wood. Smashed this guy's house, neighbour's tree, root severance when these pavers went down, just like when the driveway went down. And I just wonder how many of those sorts of scenarios are out there, because they can go. And why this failed was the crown was healthy, beautiful looking tree, dense, lush. It was an easterly wind. This is on the east. We get 2 real big easterly blows a year, and the force of the wind was enough to... Northerlies and westerlies, not a problem, because that's our prevailing wind, because it had enough roots. It had enough roots on that side here. Nearly done. Whoops, sorry. This is one where I did allow construction within the tree protection zone of an agonis and Eucalyptus cephalocarpa. We see permeable paving, constructed above grade. They used a structural soil. This is now 2 years old. The tree's looking great. There's mulch everywhere. I'm successful that tree will continue to thrive and survive. And it gets back to that opening thing, where everyone works together, we can achieve results like that. This is this is an English oak. Thank God there was a neighbour there that loves trees. She rang us virtually every other day, but that's okay. So I'm out there, the permit condition says you've got to have tree protection zone around the around the tree, around the trunk, the TVZ. Went out there. Those panels there were actually for the front fence. So ran the applicant up. He gave me the number of the owner. Spoke to the owner and said, look, if you don't get someone out there to put the tree protection fence up, I said, you've got the permit, read the permit, it is very clear, it tells you what to do. We will shut the site down. So I went back the next afternoon, that afternoon, and this is what he's done. This is the driveway, like the tree is here. I said, no, that's not a tree protection zone. So I met him on site. I spent, 2 hours with him, explaining how trees function, how they grow, why they need to be protected, that we don't want to make life hard for him, but if he doesn't do something to protect this tree, life is going to get hard for him. So, he put some planking down. This was the next day. Said, look, fantastic, you got the idea. Can we move it to over here? It's nice to want to protect the footpath, but I think the tree's roots need, He did. He extended the tree protection zone, negotiated with him a little bit because he had plumbers working there. So I said, okay, then we'll just do that, but please make sure that's all mulched. He did all that and maintained that for the duration of the thing. Very, very pleased. So the unit's built. Get a call from the lady.
Tapping line.
Yeah. She says they've open trenched all the way through between the plinth and that. I couldn't find any evidence of that. I'm hoping like all hell that they've actually bored. Don't know. To add insult to injury, to make his point, I said make sure the tree's mulched. So he's mulched every other garden bed around with black mulch. This is all he could spare for the tree. So even when you win, sometimes you can lose. This is where I work. I'm very proud of this picture. Even though Yarra Ranges, and that's a national park, but you can say the Yarra Ranges. But this is what we're trying to protect. This is what we want to protect. This is what the community is saying that they value. It's a work in progress, been at it for 10 years, I'm still learning. But if we can work together on those tree protection zones, then I think it makes everyone's jobs a lot easier. Thank you.